In the heart of deep space, where stars blinked like quiet witnesses and colossal ships floated in perfect silence, the Galactic Union's central station glowed. Like a polished gem, a beacon for all civilizations who had risen beyond their planets and reached for the stars. The Union was a place of judgment, of diplomacy, and above all of power. And in the great hall of arrivals, a new visitor stepped through the gates, a human. His name was Adam, dressed not in armor or advanced battlesuits, but in a simple gray robe. He walked with calm feet and carried nothing but a small metallic briefcase, his face calm, his eyes steady. Not a single guard walked beside him, no weapon hung from his side, and the official standing in the welcome bay stared, as if unsure whether this was bravery or stupidity, because in the Galactic Union, strength had always spoken first, and peace came only when strength had spoken loud enough. Adam moved forward slowly, yet with purpose, his body straight, like he carried something greater than fear. Some guards exchanged glances, a few alien diplomats whispered in their own tongues, some snorted in disgust, and others laughed softly at the idea of a representative from Earth arriving unarmed. The human planet was new to the interstellar table, their technology barely scraping into relevance, their people emotional, unpredictable, always divided among themselves. So how could a race so fractured send someone here, expecting anything more than mockery? Still, Adam walked the long corridor, the lights above casting a quiet silver glow over the floor, his reflection smooth and clean. Behind him followed a soft humming drone, a basic translator sphere that ensured his words would carry across all tongues. It floated silently like a loyal companion. His steps eventually brought him to the edge of the central chamber, and the Grand Clerk, a six-limbed official with translucent skin, motioned him to halt. Named the clerk said without looking. Adam of Earth, the human replied in a calm voice, "Purpose, I come with a message of peace and understanding from the people of Earth." Clerk looked up, and for a second its large eyes flickered with something that might have been amusement or disbelief. "Perhaps both. You come without escort, without defense, and expect an audience with the council." Yes, there was a silence that hung in the air for just long enough to grow heavy. The clerk finally blinked and motioned for him to proceed. "You will be placed in the waiting chamber along with other delegates. Your request will be considered in due time." Adam nodded and moved forward again. The chamber was large, with seats arranged in a circular fashion around a glowing pillar of light. Representatives from dozens of species sat there, some resting in silence, others conversing softly. Some turned as Adam entered, their eyes filled with curiosity or contempt, or both. Few nodded in acknowledgement, most did note a reptilian being hissed from its seat, low and sharp. Another, with a liquid form, shifted away as if offended by his presence. A few simply stared, as if trying to understand why someone so simple would walk into a den of titans. But Adam remained still and took his seat, folding his hands over his lap, his eyes calmly watching the pillar of light at the center, where each delegate would go when called. Time passed slowly in that room. Whispers echoed across the curved walls, voices mixing and fading. But Adam stayed patient. He had come not to force doors open, but to wait until the universe allowed them to open for him. Hours maybe passed, and then a soft chime rang through the hall, and the voice of the council echoed across the chamber. "The next to speak will be the delegate from Earth." A pause swept through the room. A few beings stiffened, others leaned forward, some scoffed. Earth, the word itself, seemed like a joke spoken too seriously. But Adam rose without hesitation, walked to the center of the room, and stepped into the light as it washed over him. His features glowed not with grandeur, but with quiet strength. He looked around the room, and every face, every pair of eyes, every shape of intelligence was now focused on him. "My name is Adam," he began, "and I speak today not as a conqueror or a commander, not as a scientist or trader, not as a ruler or soldier. I stand here today simply as a human, and I bring no weapons, no fleets, no demands. I bring only what we call understanding." At first no one interrupted, but there were flickers of movement, signs of skepticism. Adam continued, his voice steady, though the air seemed to press against him like a wall. "We humans come from a small planet One filled with storms and fire and oceans and fear. We have destroyed ourselves many times. We have clawed our way back every time from disease, from war, from division. We are not perfect, but we learn and we grow, and we remember what pain feels like, and we try not to repeat. Ida's scoff rose from a corner, but Adam ignored it. His eyes moved. Slowly from one delegate to the next, he spoke of Earth's history, not as a list of achievements, but as a collection of lessons he told them of their first attempts at flight, the reaching for the stars, the mistakes that cost millions of lives, and the moments of unity that saved even more. He spoke of the strength that came not from domination, but from cooperation, not from firepower, but from endurance, not from silence, but from speaking, even when voices shook. You think us weak because we show our hearts, he said near the end, because we bleed and still stand, because we fall and still hope, but in our weakness, we have found the shape of strength. It does not crush others, it lifts them. As he stepped back from the center, the silence was different now. It was not filled with mockery, but confusion, and for a few even reflection he bowed his head slightly and returned to his seat. The light faded and a new delegate was called, but the air had shifted just slightly, not enough for change, not yet, but just enough for the idea of change to enter the room. And so the first step was taken, not with a sword, not with a threat, but with words from a single unarmed human who dared to believe the stars might listen inside the highest chamber of the Galactic Union, where only chosen voices were allowed to rise and only chosen ideas could breathe. The echoes of the human's words still lingered like mist, refusing to vanish. The grand room, carved in the shape of a sphere, floated in silent balance above the core of the council station, with each delegate seated in levitating orbs that moved gently like planets in orbit. And at the very center hovered the light platform, where voices spoke and history shifted. Adam had returned to his quarters, a simple space given to guests without rank, but his presence continued to ripple across the corridors and communication threads. The speech he had given was stored in tag, but not erased, not ignored. Many expected it to vanish like a spark in a storm, yet it kept growing, traveling through the invisible veins of the Union, where words moved faster than ships and minds connected across distance. And disbelief. Members of the council who had dismissed the human began to receive unusual reports. Entire colonies replaying the speech in their common halls, groups gathering around translators, trying to understand why a human with no weapons, no ships, no history of galactic power had spoken as if he belonged. And what was more strange was that many listeners began to nod, to discuss, to feel something they had not expected to feel, not for a human, not for an outsider. Inside the council chamber, the most powerful beings in the known galaxy had gathered, their forms strange and diverse. Some glowed with inner fire, some floated without mass, others twisted between solid and fluid, yet all sat in silence. As the discussion began, the voice of the chair echoed across the chamber, calling for order and attention. The matter on hand was the evaluation of Earth's official request to be considered a partner in the Galactic Union. Protocol was clear. New members were judged on their contribution to peace, stability, and advancement, their strength measured not just in war but in wisdom. Yet Earth had brought no treaties, no alliances, no trade routes. Only one man and one message, and that confused many, frightened some, and intrigued a few, because it broke the rules not by force, but by nature. One delegate, a tall figure of crystal and echo, spoke first, its voice calm but sharp. The human offered words, nothing more. He brought no proposal, no proof of ability. We cannot consider a species on the merit of poetry alone. Another delegate, a soft being wrapped in flowing light, responded not with challenge but with thought, and yet those words reached the outer rings faster than most treaties ever did. Colonies speak of this man not with doubt, but with hope. There is movement in the minds of the lower ranks. Something is happening, something real. Still another member, shaped like a long shadow, argued that hope without control leads to chaos, that emotion spreads faster than law, and that species ruled by feeling are dangerous to the balance. The chamber shifted, in mood a blend of tension and curiosity, forming like a slow tide, because never before had a speech alone created such division among the elders. Chair called upon the neutral overseer, an artificial being with no bias born from data and law, to speak. Its analysis was direct. The human's message scored high on emotional impact and communicative clarity. It demonstrated values aligned with long-term peace but lacked political depth and strategic value. Earth's technological score was low, but its cultural weight was growing at unprecedented speed within the shared networks. Silence followed this statement. Not heavy but alert. Something was shifting in the air, something fragile and powerful. And in that moment, a single voice broke through from the lower chamber. It was not a high delegate nor a core council member. It was a listener, a minor species. Rarely heard, but this one had permission to speak due to an ancient agreement. The being, small in stature but heavy in wisdom, floated forward and spoke. With no hatred and no fear. For ages we have been told that peace comes from strength. And we have believed it, and we have suffered under it. We have seen fleets crush rebellion in silence, speak louder than truth. But today one human stood alone, with nothing but a voice, and it reached more hearts in one day than fleets could in a year. If that is not a form of strength, then what is? The chamber fell into a longer silence, this one deeper, more uncertain than before, because those words struck at something unspoken, a truth many had buried long ago. The chair raised its limbs, signaling for a pause before the vote. It declared a recess so delegates could speak among themselves as the lights dimmed slowly and the chamber split into private rings. Meanwhile, Adam remained in his room, unaware of the full storm rising beyond the walls. He sat near the viewing window, watching the stars drift by without pattern or reason, yet somehow always in motion. He sipped a warm drink offered by the Waverna station steward, a quiet machine that neither judged nor cared for politics. And in that silence, Adam found peace, because he had come not expecting to win, only hoping to be heard, and sometimes that was enough. Back in the council, many discussions turned personal. Old wounds opened in quiet voices. Debates turned into reflections, some remembering times before power had hardened their hearts, others questioning what they had lost in the pursuit of control. And one by one they began to ask not just what the human had said, but why it had stayed with them, why it refused to fade when the chamber was called to order again. The mood had changed, not entirely, but enough. The chair spoke firmly, yet without edge. The council will now vote not on full membership, but on the permission for Earth to present a formal case to the Grand Assembly, an opportunity granted only once in a century. If approved, Earth would stand before not just the council but all member species and speak without interruption or dismissal. The orbs began to glow one by one, signaling votes across the room. Lights shimmered, some bright, some dim, but the pattern was clear. More than half had voted yes. The motion passed. The announcement spread through the internal system and soon reached Adam's room. A soft chime sounded as the message displayed across the wall. The council has granted Earth the right to speak before the Grand Assembly. Prepare for address in 72 hours. Adam stood still for a moment, then smiled. Not from pride, but from understanding. This was not victory. This was the door opening just enough for light to enter. And in that light, something was beginning to grow, something that no weapon could shape and no wall could hold. And as the stars outside continued to burn quietly, Adam prepared to step forward once again, not as a conqueror, but as a reminder that sometimes the strongest voice is the one that speaks with nothing but truth. Beyond the shining corridors of the Galactic Union, where polished metal touched quiet stars and powerful voices ruled decisions, an invisible wave had begun to move, a shift so gentle no one could predict where it would go or what it would leave behind. It did not come with noise or force. It came in thoughts whispered between workers, shared in crowded lounges, and echoed softly through the halls of stations across the galaxy, where low-ranking beings paused their tasks to listen again to the words of a human who had no army, no throne, no weapons, just a story. Adam's speech had reached further than even he had imagined. Carried by curiosity and unexpected fascination, entire education hubs began using fragments of his message. In debate rooms, low-tier planets displayed his words On public screens, even some prison sectors allowed broadcasts of the transmission, and in those dark corners, something unfamiliar began to spark not rebellion, not war, but the idea that even a quiet voice could cause the walls to tremble on the larger communication grid. Discussions erupted under titles like "The Human Question" or "The Voice Without Fire." Power leaders tried to ignore them, but the networks refused to fall. Silent every hour another system replayed the recording, not because it was ordered, but because people chose to watch again, not to study the politics, but to feel something that had not been present in most Union speeches. Hope within the council chamber. Elite members met again in smaller circles, trying to calm the fire before it spread too far. They met behind closed doors, whispered of blocking Earth's access to the Grand Assembly, suggested that the human had manipulated lower minds with emotional tricks. Some feared what would happen if more listened, if more began to believe in ideas over intimidation. But it was already too late. The message had reached the Outer Rings colonies that had long been ignored. Species labeled unimportant races, told they had no place in decisions, began to speak and share and think, and in their thoughts the human voice began to live. Not as a savior, not as a hero, but as proof that someone dared to speak differently and still be heard back. In his quarters, Adam sat by the long viewglass, watching the slow flow of ship lights pass like rivers in space. The message from the council had arrived. Earth had been granted the rare right to address the Grand Assembly, the largest collective of galactic representatives, a stage where billions of voices would listen. And nothing would be edited or filtered or cut. It was history waiting to be shaped. And Adam knew the moment was bigger than him. Did not rehearse with scripts. He did not surround himself with advisors. He only watched the stars and listened to his own thoughts, remembering where he came from, a world full of mistakes and miracles, pain and persistence, a planet where nothing ever stayed still yet. Somehow everything survived. Earth was not perfect, but it had learned and kept learning, and in that he found the strength he needed. 3 days later, the Grand Assembly chamber opened like a giant blooming flower, each seat arranged in towering spirals rising around a central floor. The largest crowd ever gathered within the Union system watched through virtual screens and projection walls. Representatives hovered in their seats, a storm of colors, lights, languages, and life, all focused on the empty floor where one figure would soon stand alone. Adam entered the hall without a guard. His robe still plain, his steps slow and steady. The echo of his footsteps was swallowed by the size of the chamber, yet the silence was loud. 1,000 eyes, 1,000 minds, all locked onto the man who came from a world many had never seen. A world many had dismissed. A world now forcing them to listen. He stepped into the center, the lights rising around him, not to glorify, but to reveal every expression, every pause, every truth. Then he began to speak, his voice not shouting, not pleading, only steady like water over stone. He spoke of Earth again, but differently now, not in history or suffering, but in change. He told them of children learning from ruins of cities, rising from ashes of people, helping each other with nothing to gain except humanity itself. He told them that Earth did not want control, that humans did not seek to lead or command, but only to be heard and seen and respected as equals, that in every human heart there was a fire not of war, but of wonder, a desire to know and share and protect, and that this fire burned strongest not when held alone, but when shared across the stars. He spoke. Some delegates frowned, others leaned forward. A few turned away, but most listened, not just with ears, but with silence, because the words touched something deep inside them, not facts, not fear, but memory. The memory of why their species first reached for the stars, not to conquer, but to understand, not to own, but to connect, and in that connection, they found purpose. The speech ended with no applause, because the Grand Assembly did not permit reactions during address. Yet when Adam stepped back from the light, the silence was no longer cold. It was thoughtful and heavy and alive, as if the air itself was waiting to breathe. And though no decision was made that day, the Union had changed just a little. Something in the foundation had cracked, not from pressure, but from truth. And in that crack light had entered outside the assembly news networks exploded messages flowed. From system to system, ordinary beings sent transmissions of support. Fragments of the speech began to appear in banners, on space stations, in street protests, in student essays, and even on the walls of military ships whose soldiers stared long at the stars, wondering if their orders still made sense. The council tried to manage the wave, but the wave no longer listened. The message had taken its own path. It no longer belonged to one man or one planet. It belonged to all who believed that peace could stand without chains, that voice could rise without violence, that truth did not need armor to be strong. And in the quiet corners of the galaxy where hope had long gone silent, a human voice still echoed, not to command, but to remind them that something different was possible beyond the shining walls of the grand assembly where Adam's voice had passed like a current of fire through frozen waters. Something darker began to stir. Not all welcomed the change. Not all believed in peace. Not all feared the rise of hope. For some it was a threat. For some it was a warning. That control was slipping through fingers built from power and pride. And so, as the message spread like a quiet rebellion across systems, unseen forces moved behind shadows, speaking in closed rooms, whispering in encrypted frequencies, forging plans that did not welcome a peaceful human voice. In the inner zone of the Union, where powerful species held grip over ancient authority and wealth, a gathering formed without record, without law, only presence, a meeting of those who had long shaped the galaxy with silent influence. They did not speak of Adam as a man, they spoke of him as a disruption, as an infection to the order that kept their power untouched. They believed his message was not wisdom but weakness, a soft poison that could inspire the small. They ignored the broken to rise, and so they agreed not with loud votes but with silence that something must be done. Back on the station, where Adam remained under limited protection, a soft alert lit the corner of his room, not loud, not urgent, only subtle. A notice of surveillance change. His clearance had been reduced, his movements now logged each hour, a suggestion wrapped in politeness that his time was being watched. Yet Adam did not react with panic or fear. He walked the same corridors with calm steps, his hands behind his back, his gaze steady, not at others but at the stars visible through the long windows, as if the galaxies themselves gave him strength. Some delegates still came to visit him, quiet visits, respectful, some curious, some confused, many seeking answers not from a leader, but from a listener. They brought him questions that others feared to ask. Why do humans care what happens here? Why risk their place for people they do not know? What do they gain from offering peace in a world shaped by strength? And to each Adam replied, not with speeches, but with simple words, because if we do not speak peace, then war speaks for us, and we have heard enough of war. On the fourth night, as silence returned to the sleeping station, a blast shook the outer corridor, not large enough to destroy but loud enough to echo alarms. A wall scorched. A system shut down. Emergency drones arrived, but found no enemy, only damage and fragments of unknown alloy. The news spread quickly. Some blamed a mechanical fault, others a random act of sabotage. But Adam knew before reports arrived that it had not been random. The blast had occurred near his assigned floor, just 2 chambers away, and it had been time for his evening walk, which by chance had been delayed. Security, increased guards were doubled. Drones followed his every step. The council sent a message of concern, carefully written with no apology, but with lines of political concern. Adam read it slowly, then folded it quietly, knowing the words meant little, because behind those lines was fear, not for his safety, but for their image. He knew they were afraid not of his life being lost, but of what his death would ignite, and yet he did not leave. He stayed walking the halls, standing by the windows, speaking to those who still came to him, not seeking safety, but holding a silent promise that retreat would be defeat. And humans had not crossed stars to retreat. They had come to stand not with weapons, but with truth. And the truth could not walk backward, far away in a neutral system. An AI species known for data precision released a full report, one that exposed the blast near Adam's quarters as not mechanical nor accidental, but carefully designed by technology. linked to a private security faction once tied to an elite council. Remember, the report was clean, clear, undeniable, and when the report reached public networks, it shattered the silence like thunder on glass. The council was forced to respond. Statements were made, investigations promised, the accused members stepped down, claiming false accusation, but the damage was done across thousands of systems. Beings watched and remembered that the human had walked unarmed, and someone had tried to silence him and failed. And in that failure, the human's words became louder. Without being spoken again, delegates who had remained silent began to shift positions. Small species sent messages of support. Mid-tier civilizations opened communication with Earth's diplomatic branch, asking for cultural exchange programs and history records. The tide had turned, not in explosion, but in exposure. Because when the powerful try to silence a quiet voice and fail, that voice becomes something more than sound. It becomes a symbol within the chambers of the council. Emergency sessions were held. Some feared open revolt from lower sectors. Others feared division from within the council itself, but most feared that change was now moving faster than their control, that the galaxy had begun to listen not to orders, but to choice. And Adam's presence now stood at the center of that choice. He was called once again to the high floor, this time with guards, not to protect him, but to remind others that he still breathed, still stood, still dared to face them. The chair of the council looked down from its ring and asked a single question. Why do you not return home? Your message has been heard. Your world is safe. You have no more duty here. Adam stood beneath the circle of lights, his eyes not lifted in defiance, but steady and calm, and replied, Earth did not send me here to be heard. Earth sent me here to listen. And as long as someone still speaks of peace, I will be here to listen and share, because that is how change begins, not by speaking once, but by speaking until others speak too. The chamber did not cheer. It did not respond. It only paused for a long moment that lasted like a breath held in time. And in that breath, something solid became uncertain. Something rigid began to bend, and though no decree was announced and no law was passed, the council knew in that silent breath that they were no longer the only ones who could shape the path of the galaxy. And as Adam left the chamber again, not in triumph but in quiet resolve, he knew that history does not always change with noise. Sometimes it changes in moments where no one claps, no one shouts, no one declares victory, but everyone feels that something is no longer the same. In the weeks that followed after the blast that failed to silence a single human voice, the entire Union trembled, not in fear, but in awakening. The message had crossed borders and systems and ranks, reaching into deep colonies, mining moons, drifting cities and places, where even light took days to arrive. And still, the words of Adam moved without engines or fuel, powered only by belief, and the simple truth that someone had spoken, not for gain, but for change. Inside the Central Council, where great decisions had always been shaped behind sealed doors, something new was happening. Voices once silent were now being heard. Beings once ignored were being invited, and the ancient structure that had stood for cycles, unchanged, was now filled with questions that no longer feared answers. The delegates began to see what they had never seen before, that unity built on fear could never stand for long. But unity built on understanding could bend and still remain. Chair called for a final summit, a gathering of representatives from all corners of the Union. Not just the elite, but the middle ranks and the outer systems. Not just those with power, but those with presence. The plan was to vote on a proposal that had never been spoken in full, until now, a change to the very core of the Galactic Unions. Rulebook, a shift from dominance to inclusion, a foundation that allowed every voice, no matter how small, to shape the shared future. Assembly Chamber prepared itself for the largest single event in the Union's recorded history. The light towers were raised, the speaker rings activated, the air charged not with power but with expectation. And as the first beings entered their seats, they carried not just documents and data, but hope, fragile and raw but growing. Adam stood in his quarters watching the announcement being transmitted across the inner panels, his face calm but his thoughts wide. He had not asked for this. He had not imagined that a voice meant only to share would be carried so far and still. He had no regret, no pride, only clarity. Because something greater than himself had risen, and it was no longer about Earth or one man or one voice. It was now about the galaxy, learning to listen not to noise, but to meaning. As he walked the corridor toward the summit hall, no guards followed. No lights guided his path. He walked alone, not because he had been forgotten, but because he had become familiar. His face, now known across thousands of systems, not as a symbol of power, but as proof that change could have a human face without weapons, without status, without conquest. The summit began with a call to silence, and the chair invited each major delegate to speak not with debate, but with truth. And they did. They spoke of their fears of losing place, of giving space to the forgotten. They spoke of past victories earned through control and future dangers that might rise if order faded. But then others spoke of new possibilities, of shared growth, of balance, not through rule, but through trust. And slowly the chamber moved from fear to thought, from resistance to willingness. When Adam was called forward, he did not speak long. He did not retell history or repeat his old words. He looked around at faces no longer strange and said only this: the future will not be built by one species or one voice. It will be built by all who dare to believe in something better. And if we cannot believe, then let us begin by listening, because listening is where peace begins. Step back, and the hall did not respond with sound, but with stillness, a stillness so full it felt like breath held by a million minds. And then the chair called for the vote, and the lights began to move across the seat, signals blinking from the inner rings to the outer reaches, and slowly the final pattern formed across the chamber. The result clear, not by majority alone, but by magnitude more than ever. Recorded before the proposal passed, the structure of the Union would change. The Council would expand. The voices of small systems would rise. The doctrine of strength first would be removed, and in its place a new foundation would be written, one that allowed for emotion and reason, for protection and understanding, a balance where all paths could exist without crushing the other. Outside the summit, the message went live across all networks. Broadcasts filled the skies over colonies and fleets and floating cities. Millions watched and waited, and when the result was announced, they did not shout or cheer or dance. They stood still and let the feeling grow inside them, because they knew something had ended and something had begun. Adam returned to his quarters once more, not to rest, but to write not reports, but letters, messages to Earth, messages to friends and allies, and those who had supported from the shadows. He wrote, without titles, without commands, only gratitude for believing when belief seemed small. Before his departure, a small ceremony was held. No golden statues, no grand banners, only a simple platform near the station's entry gates, where a crystal plaque was placed. It showed no face, no name, only the outline of a human figure standing with an open hand, and beneath it was written in shared language words that would echo across time: the galaxy changed not by force, but by the courage to speak and the patience to listen. Adam boarded a ship without escort, the same way he had arrived, and as the vessel drifted from the station's gravity, the stars grew larger again, and the vast silence of space returned. Yet it no longer felt empty. It felt full of voices waiting to be heard, futures waiting to be written. Not by conquest, but by connection. And in the years that followed, as new systems joined the Union and old rules were rewritten, the story of the human ambassador was told not as legend, but as lesson that sometimes it takes one person to remind the universe what strength truly means, not in armor, not in war, but in words, in truth, in peace. And that is how the day a human ambassador stood unarmed became the day history was no longer the same. The end.